The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. It's Karen Motzo. I'm just getting ready for a 3:15 start time. I'm going to wait another minute or two just to make sure that everybody that's signed up has time to get on, because it is indeed a strange day between late starts and snow and non-late starts. But welcome to the webinar. And I'm just going to mute myself for a minute while we wait for the last folks to get on. Okay, here we go. So if you can hear me, and would you be so kind to let me know in the questions box that you can hear me and that you can also see the screen? I successfully did an entire hour-long webinar a few weeks ago and forgot to show the screen, and the people attending clearly had not been on a webinar before because they didn't understand. So just let me know if you can hear me and if you can see my screen. You can respond in the in the questions section on your control panel. The attendees at this point are on mute. However, I can easily unmute you if you have a question or you put your hand up. There's different ways you can write a question in where it says questions. Okay. You can also, you can put a hand up and I can see if you indicate that. And, I got some positive response. I can see your title slide and clearly I can be heard. That's fabulous. So if you have questions as we go along, you can write them in, or I can unmute you if you want as well. And what else do I have to tell you? I've attached a handout because I think it's a great handout. It's from Engage New York, Protocols and Resources. It's at the bottom where it says handouts 1 of 5. So it's just a great handout. It's a great resource document. So I encourage everybody. I'm also going to post it on the Demonstrated Success site, but I thought you'd want to snag it while you were here. With regard to professional development hours, you'll get an email from us tomorrow with, I'm not sure whether it's a link or the actual PD document. And okay, I'm going to start. So welcome to Fostering Cross-Content Literacy in a Competency Model. So I was thinking while I was creating the webinar how, the conversation is shifting so wholeheartedly to competency education, and the sort of cross-content literacy, the topic of cross-content literacy, I feel like has diminished or dissipated from its heyday, like maybe 8 to 10 years ago. And I think it's super important to remember that those same best practices in fostering cross-content literacy stay whether you're working in a traditional model or in a competency model. And I would make the argument that since we are working in a competency model, it's even more imperative that we work to foster cross-content literacy because of the overlapping goals. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So welcome to the webinar. And for some reason, my text is missing. Hold on for a second. I'm just going to show my screen like that because I'm not sure why it disappeared. But I wanted for all of you to be able to read some of these thoughts from Kim Carter, who is a leader in competency education, and she's the director of the QED Foundation. And if you haven't been on Competency Works, it's a great source for all things competency education. So we want each person to start by thinking about their discipline and what it means to be in that discipline in the world. What are the themes that are essential to that discipline? And those themes form the core of the competencies. Okay, so that first statement, in my opinion, is talking about we are teaching people, through competency education, we're trying to teach students about what it means to be in that discipline in the world. And that includes the literacy skills that are necessary, right? So we're teaching kids to read like a historian, okay, to read like a scientist, to write like a scientist, and so on and so forth, and communicate, right? Using scientific language in a form, in a style that's appropriate for a type of scientific setting, for instance. The second sentence, a competency describes knowledge and skills that can be applied to novel, complex situations. So when we ask our kids to apply the knowledge and skills that they've learned to complex situations, more often than not, those complex situations involve some form of comprehension or communication. Okay, now it doesn't have to be, it might be oral communication, it might be written communication. It might be comprehension of a visual, of a video, a still visual, a piece of text. But in most times when you're asking kids to apply their learning in a complex situation, literacy skills come to play. The last sentence, the skills described in a competency will be valuable 10 years from now, even if the content knowledge has changed, right? So we're back on this question of skills. Okay, so communication and comprehension are skills that are valuable 10 years from now. They're valuable forever. And they're valuable in every single context that a student gets into or a grown-up gets into. So I think I'm welcoming in. And Mordecai, is that you?
I am here. Hello.
Hello.
I'll monitor if people ask questions. I will let you know.
That sounds terrific. I'm glad to have you. So everyone, welcome Ann Mordecai, my colleague. Hi. And she's going to, again, as she just said, she's going to monitor the question box. So I was just talking about what competencies mean and why literacy and cross-content literacy is even more important when we talk in terms of competencies. So the next few slides are basically to show you the overlapping goals of the New Hampshire model competencies. So for instance, I've taken 3 or 4 different areas. We have the arts competencies. Okay, so over here we have these are just 3 of them: presenting, responding, and connecting. So in order to be competent in the area of arts, right, students need to be able to convey meaning, so they need to be able to communicate ideas, analyze, interpret, and so on and so forth. And they need to be able to, so on the left, if you see the word presenting, okay, I'm just going to focus on the left first. Applying the skills and language of a specific arts discipline, students will demonstrate the ability to present in the arts, meaning can they create a piece and present it, okay? Can they talk about it? Can they articulate it? Can they present their ideas visually? Right. In terms of responding, applying the skills and language of a specific arts discipline, students will demonstrate the ability to respond. Can they consume pieces of art and respond to it, or a piece of art, visually or orally? Okay, and the last one is about connecting, and that has to do with collaboration, which I'm not going to focus too much on, but which is super essential when we talk about competencies and 21st century learning. This is I've chosen a couple math model competencies, or one in particular. I stayed with 6 through 8 because it's sort of your middle ground. But so metacognitive skills and communication is the competency, and the indicator here is students will use reasoning and metacognitive skills through making conjectures, justifying, and effectively, again, communicating mathematical solutions and arguments. So we see again that students need to be able to communicate either orally or in writing in order to be competent in the area of math. And this just speaks to the next gen standards and the science model competencies. Again, we see here that they need to be able to communicate evidence-based explanations. And in an inquiry model in general, just off the topic of this slide, right, students need to be able to conduct their own inquiries. And we know that science is moving steadily toward an inquiry-based model.
Hi, Karen, we have a question.
Yes.
Somebody wrote, I'm sorry I got here late. Are these New Hampshire competencies on the DOE site?
Yes, they are. These are directly from the DOE site. Thank you.
Thanks.
So just going back to the competencies from the New Hampshire competencies, the model competencies, we'll call them. The work study competencies, we have an explicit, there's 4 of them, and one of them is communication, using various media to interpret, question, and express knowledge, information, ideas, feelings, and reasoning to create mutual understanding. So those slides, the point of those slides was to basically show you the importance of what we're about to learn today. I did want to emphasize, the Common Core, 2010, we adopted it. We spent a couple of years really focusing on it. And then the next wave came, and we no longer did those Common Core presentations, and we were no longer focused in on our Common Core standards. But I do want to emphasize that the New Hampshire Career and College Readiness Standards are basically the Common Core. And I want to emphasize that there are explicit reading and writing standards for all content areas. It's not just English language arts. So right here we have reading standards in history and social studies. There are reading standards in science and technical subjects. And I interpret technical subjects to be all subjects, including the arts. And then we have the writing standards for basically across the board. So if you haven't accessed those standards and you are not aware of them, you might want to visit the Common Core site and make sure that the competencies that you've defined for a specific class or discipline are aligned and include those reading and writing standards. These next couple slides, again, emphasize the subject overlap. So in the red circle, I've listed the math practices. In the right circle, it's the next gen science practices. And then in the bottom is ELA. There's a description about what it means to be a literate person at the beginning of the Common Core standards. So that's what's sort of listed over there in the ELA bubble. And then you can see some of the overlaps. And if you look right in the middle, right, the overlap between all of these 3, we have strong base of knowledge through using context learning, rather, through context-rich texts, read and write and speak grounded in evidence. And then for math, construct viable arguments. And for science, engage in argument from evidence. Okay. And over here, I just brought in the social studies, the C3 rather. It's C3, it's not 3C. Let's see, I'm just going to, maybe I can even project now. My text disappeared before, Anne, when I went to project. It was very disturbing. So, oh, I don't like the way that's coming out. I'm going to go back to the small screen.
Good. Looks good from here.
Okay. So over here, I brought in the C3 on the right-hand side. You can see here we have the math practices on the left. We talked about constructing viable arguments. The science, we have engaging in argument. We just talked about that within the Venn diagram. The same with the CCSS and the literate graduate. We talked about those pieces, but I just wanted to point out that the C3 framework explicitly asks, that we help students to develop claims and use evidence and communicate and critique over on the right-hand side. How we doing? Any questions?
Nope, no more questions yet.
Okay.
Please ask.
So what does this mean? This is what this means for all teachers, for the art teacher, for the music teacher. I always hesitate to include the gym teacher, but I have seen it done, and I've seen it done brilliantly. And the science and the social studies and everybody who's working in your building, right? Content in a competency model and under the Common Core actually becomes the vehicle to teach these transfer skills that we're talking about. So, and we're all well aware of the de-emphasis on content and the emphasis on skills, and it's very frustrating for content area teachers, and it's a struggle. It's a struggle to decide what to not teach and what to teach in terms of content, but I think that it's clear that you can see the evidence for definitely shifting that balance. And then in terms of habits, your instruction has to challenge your students. So you have to challenge them and ask them to present, to write, to analyze written and visual texts. And again, in terms of skills, right, your curriculum is the vehicle for acquiring these skills. So let's talk about comprehension. And I just want a little disclaimer. As I started to create the PowerPoint, I realized, wow, this is a very big topic. So I go into the most detail around reading comprehension, and then there's oral presentation and written presentation at the end. But I could probably do 3 more webinars on this topic. I could probably do 3 webinars just on reading comprehension. So this is sort of an overview, we'll say. And there's a lot of great resources here. So take what you can. So when we talk about reading comprehension, the language from Common Core that evolved during the evolution of Common Core is this challenge of close reading. And it means that a student is having regular practice with complex text and working through its academic language. They're building their content knowledge through the text, and we're teaching them how to do that. And they're reading and writing and speaking grounded in evidence from the text. So those are some different components of close reading. And basically, we mean, we need to teach students how to analytically read. We need to give them text that's complex enough that it forces them to read analytically and extract meaning from the text. And the more practice we give them with this, the stronger they'll be in terms of being able to extract their own meaning from texts, from more complex texts in all areas, in all disciplines. So one way that we try to encourage these skills is, and I do encourage this in content areas, is using text sets. The idea around this is to give students varied text on a topic, and the texts could be different forms of media. The texts should be from different perspectives. So I gave a few examples here. You might decide if you're doing a research project on the Revolutionary War, okay? You might find for the students a fictional narrative. So you might do like Johnny Tremaine, okay? And then a primary document associated with the time period that we have to teach them to uncover the meaning through the various pieces of the document, and so on and so forth. And then you might find a short nonfiction article. It could be a current article that's connected to today, something, around modern day colonialism, right? And so you want to provide for them, develop text sets that allow them to engage with various types of texts and extract meaning from different places that they can then put together to come to their own, their own learning, to make their own learning. So there's some really good resources for text sets, and I listed them here, and there's more where that came from. So Common Lit, Newsela, and Reading and Writing Project. And I'm sure that most of you know about Newsela and the Reading and Writing Project out of Columbia. And hopefully you know about Common Lit. So I'm going to pause again. We okay on questions, Anne?
Yep, we are all set.
Okay.
You're doing great. Nobody's confused. It all makes sense.
So this is good old-fashioned, what is good content area reading? And this is stuff that I love this information because it's information that has stood by me for 15 years. You know, for those of you that are English teachers that are online or literacy specialists, you know Subject Matter, which is a book about basically content area reading. And these guys, Daniels and Zimmelman, are very famous, and we like them. So here's just some ideas, and they're written out to you for you. The kids using the textbook as a basic source, but venturing far beyond, that connects back to the text sets, right? When I was talking about the text set, I encourage you to include texts that integrate authentic issues, current issues, especially in middle school and high school. Consulting a variety of sources and voices so that they construct their own opinion. That sort of goes back to text sets, but also, you know, one thing I know about adolescent readers in particular is that they love to argue and they love argument. So when you are able to provide them with contrasting opinions, then when they can construct their own, it's very effective. And then we have some samples of genres down below. Now, when we talk about having a range of lengths from short to whole books, I want to update that a little bit. Not only should your reading selections have a range of lengths, but they should have a range of text complexity. And the rule is that the more complex the text, if it's a challenging text, then better to be shorter and better to give students more scaffolding, obviously, but to keep the demand of the task that they're asked to do with that text at a lower level, right? So if there's a complex text, you might ask students to summarize the text. And that would be the main ideas from the text. Okay, that might be at a basic level. And if it was a less complex text, right, you might ask them to analyze the text for a particular theme or an idea or author's perspective, you know, at a more demanding level. So you sort of have to commit to regularly integrating that complex text so that kids get practice with figuring out the meaning of text. Of course, you want your sources to be recent and up to date because, you know, we all like that. And then we encouraged, you know, be interdisciplinary. I think we all would love that. You know, we all want to do that. I think that maybe there's less time than we would like, but certainly encourage the use of science texts in English and encourage in history, you know, the use of first person narratives and so on and so forth. So in talking about the how, you should always establish a purpose for the reading. Okay. And it's great to have choice. If you can find a few different texts on a similar topic, it works really well when different kids in the classroom, maybe 3 different groups, are reading 3 different texts, and they can come together and share their ideas and share their learning because it makes them masters of their own learning and experts in what they read. It also obviously allows you to differentiate and be inclusive. And I'm a big advocate of all teachers explicitly teaching thinking strategies. So even just think alouds to help students understand the material that they're reading, and the use of graphic organizers, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Karen?
Yes.
We have a question.
Okay.
Can you speak to how to incorporate this model with literature instead of informational text, or does it, now I'm adding, does it fit more with informational text?
So this webinar is about cross-content literacy. So the idea is that literary text is used largely in English class or, in reading class. So all of the strategies and the things that I'm including here, they go without saying for any literary text as well. But I have a bias around content area text because that's also something that for years wasn't emphasized in the younger grades, and it's very much emphasized in the Common Core standards now, and it's a need. So, did that answer the question?
I don't know. I think so, but please ask more if it doesn't. Okay. Thank you.
So reading should be social. We can make reading social. We can work in pairs. We can work in teams. We can do reciprocal teaching. We can do inquiry groups. So make reading social as frequently as you can. And this is obvious, right? As good teachers, we don't focus on the right answers. We try to focus on the well-justified answers. There's nothing that shoots a kid down faster than when he knows his teacher's looking for the right answer, and the one that he offered is clearly not the right answer. I know that's different in math, but in ELA, and a lot of times, it's a well-justified answer you're looking for. And then keeping it connected to the real world, to advocacy, to action. And again, that's explicitly part of the Common Core standards, and very much a part of project-based learning and inquiry learning and problem-based learning as well. And then having assessment rely on complex performances, products, and exhibitions. So our language for that these days is performance assessment, where you're integrating a lot of different tasks to actually create a transfer event where students are asked to do something in a novel situation that in front of people or solving a problem where there's going to be some sort of public display or presentation. So I just want to talk a little bit about types of texts. On the left-hand side, we have some examples of less challenging texts. And I just want to emphasize that there's a role for these less challenging texts. Super important, right? Self-selection is super important, and I encourage it. And then on the other side, we have some challenging texts, so textbooks, primary text, research articles, and so on. And again, you're going to use more scaffolding when you're introducing challenging texts. You're going to lower the rigor or the demand of what you're asking students to do, and you're going to model more. And this speaks a little bit to the question earlier. When we grow up and we go into the world, aside from reading on the couch before we go to bed at night, mostly reading is informational reading. And it is gathering information and evaluating the information that comes at us in the world. And most of that information is it's nonfiction, right? It's information. And it's super important that we teach our kids how to understand a variety of texts and critique the value and the truthfulness and figure out the meaning and detect the bias in the myriad of texts that come their way or that they seek out, right, through their workplace or wherever they end up. And I alluded to this before, prior to 2010, when we accepted the Common Core standards, there wasn't so much informational text work going on in elementary and middle school. And so that shift has been made, and we are to gradually be using more informational text as the students move up through the grades. And this third bullet, different texts have different structures, and part of the way we make meaning is being able to identify the structure of a text so that you can anticipate the meaning. So if you sit down with a piece of text that's comparing and contrasting two different, pieces, maybe it's two books or two events, or then you're going to read that in a different way because you're going to anticipate the different pieces that come up and compare and contrast, right? Usually one thing is presented and then another thing is presented. And then after that, they take different aspects and they go back and forth, and you're going to anticipate that. You're going to be able to look for words like, in contrast, comma, or although, or however, and when you can anticipate those words and you're used to reading them and creating meaning, it makes it easier for you as you have more practice using different kinds of informational text structures. So this last bullet is super important, right? No student wants to sit there and hear a teacher deliver information to them day in and day out. And the better kids get at building knowledge through text, the more engaged they will be, the more freedom they will have, the more responsibility they will be able to take over their learning. Now, there's a caution piece here, because I remember when I was first training folks to do close reading, the kids were losing it because it was such hard work. And it was so meticulous in terms of annotating texts and figuring out vocabulary words. So I would caution you that when you're using complex text, again, make sure it's short and make sure that you keep the demands low and vary your texts, right? Don't use tough texts every time you choose to, apply some sort of, one of these literacy ideas or skills, or if you're every time you're working on text in class with your students. What else do I need to add to that? Yeah, so just to say it again, like for instance, there's nothing wrong with using Newsy-LA and bringing it down a level, because Newsy-LA or Newsella, you can flex the Lexile. So there's nothing wrong with flexing the Lexile down and staying very comfortably within a group of students' reading levels, and that it becomes less laborious if you do that frequently. So this slide just contrasts. This gives you a really good example of what I'm talking about when I talk about text complexity. And I'm going to give you a second to read these two versions. And I'm actually going to go get my charger because I'm running out of charge. Hi, I'm back. All right, so, right, the bottom tells you exactly, that's the message right there. And but if we wanted to, we could give our kids the bottom version every time. And you know what? They'd get the content. They'd get it. They'd learn what we needed them to learn. We could give them a quiz, and they could move on. But the top version gives students an opportunity to work through the language. It gives them practice. It gives you the opportunity as the teacher to show them different strategies to work through the language so that they can then start to use those strategies independently, so that when they meet complex text in other settings, they know how to move through it and get meaning from it. So unless we give the kids these opportunities for practice, and unless we give ourselves opportunities to teach them using this sort of complex text, they're not going to learn it. But it's frustrating, I think, for content area teachers who really hold their content close to their hearts. And, you want your students to be able to master and learn what you deem as necessary content, and working on complex text with them, conveying the content through this sort of complex text takes a little longer. And it's up to you as the teacher to decide when you're going to use complex text as a tool and when you're not. Anne, is that clear to you?
Yes, that's very clear.
My math specialist.
Yes, if I can understand it, then anybody can. Yes, no, that makes perfect sense.
And this is just a quote, I like it, right? Words are not just words. They are the nexus, the interface between communication and thought. When we read, it is through words that we build, refine, and modify our knowledge. We make meaning through specific words, right? The specificity of words changes the meaning in subtle ways. And it's important to have that interplay when we're looking at texts with kids. So text-dependent questions, we've been doing this for ages. It's not new. They renamed it into this beautiful text-dependent questions, but like in social studies, what's it called? What's it called? It has a name. When you're doing AP social studies, it has a special fancy name. Anyway, we've always been creating text-dependent questions. It's, by instinct, teachers take a piece of text and then they ask students questions based on the text because we know, right, that it's going to help the kids understand the text. What I'm talking about is sort of that on steroids, right? Just taking it up a notch and making sure that the questions that we do create for them or that we train them to create for themselves, it really asks them to reread, right? They're not easy answers. There's different levels of questions. It's, if you're a literacy person, you might know, right there questions are, super easy in the text, one word answers, and then there's author and me questions, and they go to different levels, right? But we want to make sure that the questions that we ask are asking our kids to really reread and make inferences from whatever text they're working with. And to do this right is actually sort of hard. I love the sentence, teachers need to construct such queries and orchestrate learning experiences. So what you're doing through the text-dependent questions is instead of teaching the student, you're orchestrating their experience. You're setting the path of their learning, but you're allowing them to create the meaning on their own. So these are pretty obvious, right? So on the left, pretend we read Letter from a Birmingham Jail. On the left we have, what can you infer from King's letter about the letter that he received? So, this does not ask the student necessarily. Wait a second. No. You see the labels up there? I'm getting confused as I'm talking.
You're backwards, right?
That's backwards. Ha, that's
okay.
Funny.
Thanks.
Hold on for a second. I'm gonna.
That's all right. Oh.
I'm just gonna fix it because that's
right. That's easy.
Sorry. As I'm saying it, I'm thinking, wow, that's not right. So if you, on the left-hand side, right, what can you infer from King's letter about the letter? So you have to have read the letter, right? And you have to sort of read the letter and then think about the voice of the letter that he's responding to, right? And get creative about what was the message in the original letter. On the right-hand side, you're writing about your ideas, okay? You're writing about a personal experience. I didn't need to read the text for that. And then on the left-hand side, again, for the text-dependent questions, why is this year significant to the events described in the speech? So it's specifically refers to events described in the speech, and it asks you to contextualize those events in the time period. And on the right-hand side, you're talking about equality and your own personal opinion, basically. So these are just some steps to creating text-dependent questions. When you have a text that you are sharing or working with students, you need to read it several times yourself first. If you haven't done that, you have a problem. And that's just crummy teaching, not doing that. Sometimes my kids come home and they have viewed videos that they swear their teachers haven't viewed. I'm so sad about that. So once you've read and reread the text, whatever text you're sharing with your students, right, you really think about what is the core idea, what are the core ideas that I need kids to get out of this text? Where do I need them to get to? And then you're going to identify any vocabulary that they're going to need to work through to get to that meaning. Now remember, it's not just any vocabulary they don't know or that they're going to have to work. It's the vocabulary that specifically points to the core content or the most important key ideas that you need for them to get out of that text. And you're also going to think about what's rough here. Right? You're going to move through it and think about what's rough, and you're going to definitely address a text-dependent question to those rough areas. When you are creating questions, apologies. When you are creating questions, start with your easier questions. And when you're presenting questions to your students, start them with the easier questions, because it's not nice for a student to come face to face with a really challenging question immediately, right? It sort of softens them up a little bit, makes them feel like they can. You always want to connect. This goes back to identifying core content and ideas, right? What are the lesson standards? What is it? What are your goals? Connect your questions to the goals. And you're going to create, a culminating assessment. It doesn't have to be assessment. It can be any sort of formative, it's just a set of questions that are aligned. These are just some phrases. And if you want, I actually did an entire webinar on text-dependent questions last year for the consortium. If you want access to that, I would encourage you, just send me an email and I will give you the link to it. All right. I don't have time to get in depth, but I will say that when you have successfully created a set of text-dependent questions, it's just a really satisfying feeling. And okay. I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted because I wasn't anticipating anyone coming into my house, and now my family's home, so I apologize. Pushing student thinking. This is the first of 3 times you're going to see this slide. I just want you to remember these. It seems so obvious, but what makes you say that? How do you know? Where in the text did you find that? And can you tell me more? And why do you think that? The power of these 5 sentences are brilliant. In some ways, these are distinguishing sentences between a really empowered teacher and a teacher who's getting the most out of their kids and a teacher that may not be. So I think that I would encourage you to leverage those questions. So academic vocabulary. I'm actually going to relocate because I'm in the middle of giving a webinar. Academic vocabulary. There's tier 1 vocabulary, tier 2 vocabulary, and tier 3 vocabulary. And I didn't even address tier 1 because tier 1 is your everyday spoken vocabulary. So you don't need to be working through that in the text that you're using with kids. But your tier 2 and tier 3 oftentimes is vocabulary that you will need to address directly in whatever text you're using. Tier 2. So Tier 3 tends to be more content-based, all right? If you see the second bullet for Tier 3, it says specific to the discipline or the content area. So those are those fancy words in science or the fancy words in history or art that a kid needs to know in order to be fluent and competent in a discipline area. And Tier 2 are more like academic words that are not unique to a specific discipline. They're actually not easily defined by context clues, right? But they're applicable across disciplines, and the kids are going to see them over and over and over again. So I would encourage you to always, when you're going through a piece of text that you're using with students, find those Tier 2 words and choose a few to emphasize. If you're really fabulous, you might create an interactive word wall where you're pulling words from your reading on a regular basis and sticking them up on the wall. And that's a whole strategy that's actually in the protocols that I attached to the handout. So this is a sweet example from Seymour Simon, where you're going to read this. I'm not going to make you read it because we don't have time. But, oh, goodness, it's getting late. So if you, the point here, and I'm going to post this PowerPoint if you want to use it further or use it with peers or colleagues in a way that to illustrate to them about different vocabulary and the power of vocabulary and the types of vocabulary. This is your basic volcano paragraph, right? And now I'm going to color the different levels of vocabulary. And the red vocabulary words are Tier 3 words, right? So we're talking about volcanoes, that's content, mantle, crust, magma, and lava. I'm not really coming across those words. They're really important to understand the concept of volcanoes, but they're Tier 3. I'm not coming across that language outside of the study of volcanoes. That said, the blue words are Tier 2 words. And a word like spouted, I need to know about spouted if I'm going to, that's a lot of different, we could be talking about what spouts? A geyser spouts, like lots of different things. Molten is a really powerful word that the kid could actually use in his or her writing to describe something, hot. Is entirely different. And obviously, words like eruption, pours forth, those are all words that are Tier 2 words that are important. And you have to decide, okay, which of the words am I going to teach to explicitly? And which of the words am I not going to? Which of the words can the kids figure out on their own or in groups? Right? So facilitating their discovery of meaning in small groups, using protocols for that is great. Oh, so this just speaks to what I was talking about earlier. How do we choose? And there you go. Choose the words that are important to understanding. What are they likely to encounter again? What can they use in their writing? I mean, I would love if my third grader used the word molten in his or her writing. I don't actually have a third grader, but and if they have varied meanings. So the fourth bullet down, I love that one, can be worked with in a variety of ways and connect to other words and concepts. So it's especially fun to pull out those words that have different meanings in different contexts and to play with that. This is just a reminder. If you are going to emphasize certain vocabulary, so to put in a plug at the higher levels, in middle school and high school in particular, sometimes what I encourage schools to do is to create an academic vocabulary list. And these exist already. Avril Coxhead is one. I don't know if I put that, if I have it in a resource slide here, but she has an academic vocabulary list that's really good. And to agree, let's say with your 6th grade team, your interdisciplinary team, or your 9th grade team, that these are 50 words that we are, going to integrate into our instruction this year. So, anyway, 10 to 15 times, right? They can't internalize new vocabulary unless they see it in context, all right, between 10 and hear it and use it 10 to 15 times. These are some ideas, word sorts. And again, these are in the handout that I attached down below. There's open-ended sorts, there's closed sorts, but word sorts allow some really nice scenarios where kids are asked to analyze and classify information, and they get a lot of meaning. So you could give students, a group of words and have them word sort prior to a unit to warm them up, and to also almost as like a pre-assessment to see, you can see through observing them, in groups, what they're familiar with, what they're not familiar with. It's an anticipatory activity. If you give them the words without context, they're already starting to think, well, what are we starting? What are we learning? I'm interested. I know what this word means. And then, they may know what it means, but they may not know what it means in the context of the instruction that you're about to introduce. So it's just a really fun way to start a unit, but then it's also a fun way in the middle of a unit to get information about where the student's learning is thus far. And then it's a great way at the end to assess learning in a formative, integrated way, within the instruction. And as I've been talking, I hope you've been reading the bullets, which are more academic than we need right now. This just gives you how to do a word sort. It involves index cards or sticky notes. You can either provide the categories for kids, or you can just let them have at it, and it's kind of fun. And the best part is when you have them create a sort, an open sort in particular, and you have them debate the reasons why they categorized words in that way. It's a whole other higher level activity. And these are just this is an example of a closed word sort, right? We have estuary, ocean, stream. And then we have a bunch of vocabulary up there that would be on cards, and the kids would sort them. And this is open word sort. Okay, so using analytic graphic organizers, we all think we know what graphic organizers do. Again, I just want to, that the handout that I attached has some good information about graphic organizers. But this is the power of how these bullets list how graphic organizers facilitate your thinking. But it's not just any graphic organizer, right? It has to be a good graphic organizer. And I would advocate testing your graphic organizers and really asking yourself, is this furthering the learning for my student, right? Is this helping or encouraging my student to think in terms of cause and effect or sequence, right? Is this helping my student in terms of thinking about main idea and key details, right? Or support or, a claim and evidence, okay? So be careful when you use analytical graphic organizers and make sure that they're high quality and that they actually are facilitating the type of connections and relationships that you're after. The Freyer model is a great model for concept learning. So you see in the middle, there's stars, and the way when kids are trying to make sense of a concept, right, it's very helpful for them to have examples, and then also to contrast that with non-examples. And wow, there's a lot going on for me during this webinar today. And then the characteristics and the definition, and you can change the variables in the Freyer model to suit your needs. but it's a super nice format to help kids to construct their own meaning. So you might give them a blank Freyer model with an article, an informational article, and ask them to complete the Freyer model, and then pair share with a neighbor and compare and contrast the way that they used it. This is just another example of a graphic organizer that, or two examples really. Okay, pros, cons, evidence. And this is what I was speaking to before. Is it going to enhance the student performance and enhance student learning? And to take it a step further, it's really cool if you can get your kids to start to choose. So you provide them with a graphic or an analytic organizer, then you give them a couple to choose from. And then ultimately you can encourage them to create their own, over the course of a year, let's say, depending on the age of the students. Because then they have that. We talk about math and creating models. It's the same thing with using analytical graphic organizers. Create a structure, a pre-writing structure, let's say, or a pre-presentation structure that's going to help me to process my thoughts. Here's another strategy to increase comprehension. So these are all comprehension strategies, and this has to do with coding and annotating. Now, I'm hoping that with the last wave of cross-content literacy, professional development, and it was like all the rage about 10 years ago, I am really hoping that every single teacher in the whole world has their students annotating text in some way or coding when they're working on texts with kids, right? Because that's what we do, right? We underline, we write questions on the sides, we write images on the sides, we write connections on the side, right? We star things that are important. We double underline things. It's all the habits that we have as readers. And it helps them to engage. It takes heavy duty, gradual release of responsibility in order for kids to annotate text or code text effectively. So what I mean is, no matter what the age of student you're teaching, you are going to have to model it several times, okay? And then you might even have to give them a model of annotated text and ask them to discuss it with a peer, right? And then you might have to have them do it in small sections while you're reading in the class and have a pair share or report back as a whole class, right? And have conversations about it. So it should be quite a while until you're sending kids home with a piece of text and having them annotated at home and coming back and bringing it in. Even after you're doing that, it would be great to give them a rubric or to develop with them a rubric where they can self-assess their own annotations and the effectiveness of their annotations or their coding. When I say coding, I mean something like this. This is a lovely way to start out the idea of annotation, right? And where it says at the top, use 2 or 3 codes at a time. When you're teaching this, when you're trying to get kids into the habit, it would definitely over the course of an entire year. Okay. This happens, this gradual release of responsibility. Focus on one thing, right? You may just have kids code for claim and evidence and then come back, right? Key ideas and come back. Or on the right-hand side, like choose something, read this 1.5 page text and just do RIP for where it gets really interesting or where you don't agree. Okay. So one thing at a time, 2 things at a time.
Karen?
Yeah, we're running out of time.
We have a question, but I also want to remind you that it's about 4:13 right now.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to stop here, but it's good because I'm actually at a good thematic place to stop, and I'll explain in a second. So do you want me to answer the question?
Well, the question is the webinar being recorded so that I can share it with my colleagues?
Yes, it is being recorded. And I'm going to send you, actually I won't, Britt will send out the link to the webinar.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I'm going to speak for 30 seconds, right? This slide is the most important slide that teachers can look at. If you've seen nothing else on this webinar, this slide is the single most important piece of the webinar, right? Everything I've just told you in terms of strategies or techniques or, that you want to take back with you, it is very important that you start up in the upper left corner, high levels of support. Whether that means close reading, whether it means using graphic organizers, whether it means coding text. Give kids very limited control, and you are going to take them through. You're going to spoon feed them. And finally, you're working slowly down the bottom right. Okay? Then they have a lot of choice. They have a lot of freedom. They have a lot of independence. But this process of gradual release is super slow. And across the top, you have demonstration, shared demonstrated, guided practice, independent practice, and so on. So what I would do if we had more time is I would talk about oral communication and speaking and listening, and then I would go on to writing. The webinar will be posted. I am super happy to talk about any part of the webinar with any of you independently. This is my passion. And I don't always get to share my passion these days. Over many, many, many years, I have dozens and dozens of resources. There are resources at the end of this PowerPoint. And there's 6 or 7 of my bestest resources. So I would encourage you, after you get the link, it's going to take me about a day to post it, to record it, and post it, and so on and so forth. I would encourage you to go access those resources. And definitely download the document that I attached to the webinar. Okay. I'm
all right.
done. Any last minute questions or queries? Thank you.
No less.
No, nothing. Okay.
We can stay on for a couple minutes if people want.
But I do want to thank you to everybody who came, and I hope that it was interesting for you.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and take care. And I hope you have school tomorrow if you didn't have school today. So have a great night. Thanks.
Okay.